Welcome back, and thank you for joining me. Today's story is one of the most unbelievable bank heists ever carried out, planned in silence, beneath the streets of France. If you enjoy calm, documentary-style mysteries like this, feel free to subscribe for more long-form stories. Now, let's begin. In the summer of 1976, the coastal city of Nice on the French Riviera seemed like one of those places where life moved slowly and elegantly, where tourists filled the cafes along the Mediterranean, where evenings felt warm and effortless, and where nothing truly dangerous ever appeared to disturb the polished surface of everyday life. And yet, beneath that calm atmosphere, deep under the streets that people walked across without a second thought, something extraordinary and almost unbelievable was already unfolding in complete silence. Because far below the city, inside the dark and twisting sewer system of Nice, a small group of men was carrying out the first steps of what would become one of the most audacious and legendary bank robberies in modern history, not with guns or violence, not with explosions or alarms screaming into the night, but with something far more unsettling: patience, precision, and the willingness to spend months preparing for a single moment. Their target was the vault of Société Générale, one of France's major banks, a place designed to be unreachable, protected by steel doors, thick concrete, and the comfortable assumption that no one could ever enter from the ground below, because banks were built to defend themselves against obvious threats, against desperate criminals rushing through the front entrance, against chaos and panic, but not against an enemy willing to approach with absolute quiet. And the man who understood this better than anyone was Albert Spaggiari, a calm, intelligent figure whose mind worked less like a common thief and more like an architect, because he realized that the greatest weakness of any secure system is not the strength of its walls, but the predictability of the way humans believe danger will arrive. Banks expected violence, they expected urgency, they expected someone to make mistakes under pressure, and so they built their defenses around that expectation. But they were not prepared for someone who would simply disappear underground and take as much time as necessary. The plan, in retrospect, sounded almost unreal in its simplicity, because instead of attacking the bank from the outside, Spaggiari and his team would approach it from beneath, using the sewer tunnels as hidden pathways, carving a new route through stone and earth, moving slowly enough that no one above them could ever suspect what was happening under their feet. Night after night, week after week, the tunnel grew longer, dug quietly through layers of concrete and rock, and what makes this part of the story so haunting is that during all of this time, life above ground remained completely ordinary, with employees unlocking the bank doors every morning, customers depositing money, security systems humming with quiet confidence, unaware that directly below them, the vault's isolation was being destroyed piece by piece. It was difficult work, brutal work, but it was invisible, and invisibility is often the greatest weapon of all, because a threat that cannot be seen is a threat no one prepares for. And then, in July of 1976, after months of digging, measuring, and planning, the tunnel finally reached its destination, pressing against the underside of the vault itself. And in that moment, the impossible became real, because the criminals were no longer outside the fortress. They were directly beneath its heart. On a chosen weekend when the bank would remain closed and the city above would sleep peacefully, Spaggiari and his team entered the tunnel and made their way forward in the darkness, carrying tools, food, and the calm certainty of men who knew they had already won, because the robbery was no longer about breaking in. It was simply about stepping through the opening they had created. When they finally emerged inside the vault, the scene was almost surreal, because instead of chaos, instead of frantic movement, they treated it like an occupation, settling in with an almost absurd sense of comfort, opening safety deposit boxes one by one, examining valuables, gathering cash, jewelry, gold, and documents, not with haste but with the steady rhythm of people who believed time was on their side. And perhaps the most famous detail of the entire Shirjian is that they stayed there for hours, even eating and drinking inside the vault, as if mocking the very idea that this place was supposed to be untouchable, and at some point, they even left behind a message, written almost like a signature, a chilling reminder of how complete their control had been. They wrote, simply, that they had stolen without weapons, without hatred, and without violence, as if they wanted the world to understand that this had not been an act of brutality, but an act of pure strategy. By the time the bank reopened and employees finally discovered what had happened, the shock was immediate, because the vault had not been blasted open. No alarm had been triggered, no guards had been overpowered, and yet enormous wealth was gone, taken from the most secure space the bank possessed by criminals who had arrived from the one direction no one had considered. And as police began to swarm the scene, trying to understand how something like this could happen, the realization slowly emerged that they were dealing with something more than an ordinary robbery, because this was not desperation, it was engineering, it was patience, it was a criminal operation that had unfolded right beneath the city in complete silence. But the most unsettling part was still to come, because stealing millions was one thing, escaping afterward was another, and the story of Albert Spaggiari and how this heist ended would only make the mystery even deeper. In the days that followed the discovery of the robbery, the atmosphere in Nice began to shift, because what had happened inside the vault of Société Générale was not simply a theft, it was an embarrassment on a national scale, a reminder that even the most modern security could be defeated by something as old and quiet as human patience. And the police now found themselves standing in a crime scene that made no sense in the way crimes were supposed to make sense. There were no shattered doors, no gunshots, no dramatic escape captured on camera, only a tunnel leading down into darkness, and the unsettling understanding that these men had not rushed, but had taken their time, moving through the vault as if they belonged there, calmly selecting valuables that ordinary people would never even see in a lifetime. Investigators quickly realized that this was not the work of amateurs, because digging through reinforced ground beneath a city required planning, equipment, knowledge of the sewer network, and above all, discipline. The kind of discipline that is rare even among criminals. And as the scale of what had been taken became clearer, the case transformed into something far larger than a local robbery. Reports varied, estimates changed, but everyone agreed on one thing. The loss was enormous, and the psychological impact was even greater, because the public could not stop imagining the scene, a hidden group of men underground, entering a vault not by force, but by intelligence, treating the heart of the bank like a room they had rented for the night. And then there was the message they left behind, that infamous line claiming they had stolen without weapons, without hatred, and without violence, a sentence that sounded almost philosophical, as if the robbers wanted to be remembered not as brutal thieves, but as artists of strategy, and in doing so, they only deepened the legend. For weeks, the police searched for leads, following rumors, interviewing workers, tracing possible connections to the city's underground infrastructure, because someone had to know the sewer system well enough to navigate it. Someone had to understand the bank's layout. Someone had to have the confidence to believe this impossible plan could succeed. And slowly, one name began to rise above the noise: Albert Spaggiari. Spaggiari was not a man who fit neatly into the image of a traditional mastermind, because his life had been fragmented, shaped by past adventures, political extremism, and the kind of restless personality that seemed drawn toward risk. And yet, for investigators, he suddenly appeared at the center of the web, a figure whose intelligence and connections made him capable of organizing something far beyond an ordinary theft. Eventually, Spaggiari was arrested. It should have been the end of the story, the moment where the legend collapsed into paperwork and prison walls, the moment where millions of francs would be recovered, and the criminals would finally be reduced to names and court documents. But Albert Spaggiari was not finished, because what happened next became almost as famous as the heist itself. During an interrogation, while sitting inside a police office, surrounded by officials who believed they finally had their man, Spaghiari did something so sudden and unbelievable that it sounded like another myth, another story too cinematic to be real. He stood up, he moved toward the window, and before anyone could stop him, he jumped. Spaghiari leapt from the office window, landing outside where a motorcycle was waiting, and in a matter of seconds he was gone, vanishing into the city as effortlessly as he had once vanished into the tunnels beneath it. It was an escape so absurdly bold that it cemented his status not just as a criminal, but as a legend, because now the man behind the heist of the century had also carried out one of the most infamous escapes in French history. And from that moment forward, the case took on an almost surreal atmosphere, because authorities were no longer simply searching for stolen money. They were searching for a ghost, a man who had humiliated the system twice, once underground and once in broad daylight. Spaghiari fled France, living in hiding, rumored to be moving through Italy and other parts of Europe, always just beyond reach, always protected by a mixture of secrecy, luck, and the strange admiration that sometimes surrounds criminals who commit their crimes without bloodshed. The stolen fortune was never fully recovered. Some believed it had been laundered through networks that could never be traced. Others believed it was hidden away, waiting to be claimed. And there were whispers that much of it had already disappeared into the shadows of offshore accounts and quiet transactions long before the police had even realized how deep the tunnel truly went. Spaghiari himself maintained an almost theatrical posture, presenting the robbery not as cruelty, but as rebellion, as if he wanted history to remember him as something other than a thief. And in that strange self-mythologizing, he succeeded, because decades later, the tunnel heist of Nice is still spoken about with a kind of disbelief. Not because it was the largest robbery in history, not because of violence, but because of the method, the audacity, the patience. The idea that for months, men could work unseen beneath a city, moving closer and closer to a vault that everyone assumed was invulnerable, and that in a single weekend, they could quietly enter, take what they wanted, leave behind a message, and vanish again into the underground world they had used as their doorway. Albert Spaghiari would never truly face the full consequences of his crime. He lived the rest of his life on the run, and when he died years later, the stolen wealth remained part of the mystery, an unanswered question hanging over the story like the darkness of the sewer tunnels themselves. And perhaps that is why this case continues to fascinate, because it feels less like an ordinary robbery and more like a parable, a reminder that the greatest breaches do not always come from brute force, but from imagination, from patience, and from the simple truth that human beings rarely defend against what they cannot even imagine. The vault was meant to be untouchable, but the criminals never touched its doors. They came from below, and they left behind one of the most haunting lessons in modern crime history. That sometimes the safest place in the world is only safe until someone decides to think differently.